What would you begin with as you try to dissect these documents?
Well, it's hard to know where to start exactly. I'd be interested to see how they are categorizing the material as they upload it to the website. Already, Mr. Blanche has signaled in his letter that there is a great deal of information that has not yet been provided. There was something in his letter that also caught my eye in particular. He said that the department was going to be withholding material based on various common law privileges, including work product privileges and deliberative process privileges, in addition to material withheld for the reasons that are identified in the Epstein Act as bases for withholding information. So essentially, it sounds like the department is going to assert as a rationale for withholding some material that it has essentially privilege over those materials. That's not something specified in the Act as a basis for withholding information. That could be a reason for the department to say, we're not going to give you all of the internal memos within the DOJ for why particular individuals were not charged, for example. So that caught my eye in particular.
Okay, sure. We saw in the Blanche letter essentially an executive summary of this first tranche. Write that protecting victims is of the highest priority for President Trump, the Attorney General, the FBI, and the Department of Justice. As part of the review and production, the department solicited counsel for any victims of Jeffrey Epstein and invited counsel to provide us with names of victims, whether previously identified or not. I talked about redactions, Professor, earlier today with Robert McWhirter, the constitutional criminal law attorney. Here's what he had to say.
There's nothing to evaluate the completeness of the disclosure. People are going to have to look at this with a fine-tooth comb, because I do not trust this administration to give everything. And in fact, there's indications that they want to just dish out things that would make Democrats look bad and pull back things that make Republicans and the president look bad.
Do they have purview over redactions, Professor? Because we're going through a lot of pages right now, and in some cases, they're completely blacked out.
So the act that was passed by Congress gives the Department of Justice the authority to withhold information, to redact for very limited bases, but they do include to protect the privacy interests of the survivors. Importantly, the Act also requires the Department of Justice to provide a justification for all the redactions within 15 days after the completion of release of information required to be disclosed by the Act. So I'm going to be looking to see what the Department of Justice says when it provides that subsequent justification for redactions. One thing that's going to be difficult to pin down now is when is the deadline for providing that justification. The act that was passed by Congress said today is the date for the release of information, and then said 15 days after disclosure of the information required by the act is complete, the department has to provide the justification for all of its redactions. And so the question is, given that it's an incomplete release today, when does that subsequent deadline kick in? But I really want to see what the department is going to say by way of justification for all the redactions.
Professor, as you're speaking, we're scrolling through the pages here on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube, just showing black box after black box, redaction after redaction. As I mentioned a minute ago, some full pages are completely blacked out. Does this go to court? Even if we know that all the documents are released, will those justifications be challenged?
They may be challenged, but it would be by Congress. There's no recourse that I can see for any individual who is interested to go to court and demand a justification for the redactions. I think this would essentially be a political recourse for Congress to call members of the Department of Justice before them to testify. There are various political measures available to Congress, for example, withholding funds from the Department of Justice. They could, in theory, and I've heard this already suggest impeachment of various Department of Justice officials. But the Act doesn't provide a private cause of action for individuals who are interested in the material to go to court. At least I can't see a way for doing that. So it looks to me like it's more of a political consequence for the department if they don't comply.
Remember when Attorney General Pam Bondi said many months ago, toward the beginning of the year, that the so-called client list was on her desk. Now that we know that this is broken into hundreds of thousands of documents, it appears there is no client list. Was the Attorney General lying?
Well, the Attorney General created expectations a long time ago, and I think the act is the consequence of having created those expectations that were then not met. She created those expectations. President Trump did on the campaign trail, as did his FBI director, in saying that they would release all the files when they came into office, and then further going ahead and saying that there was a client list. So they created these expectations, and now the question is, will the release in any way meet them? And I expect it will not. But I do want to point out that one thing that is explicitly required in the act that was passed by Congress is that the Department of Justice provide a list of all government officials and politically exposed persons who are named or referenced in the released material. That is something that's going to have to be provided within 15 days after completion of the release of the material. And so, in effect, there will be at least a list of these sort of persons that may be of great public interest that the Department of Justice has to provide. That does not mean it is a client list at all.
It's interesting to read through this letter as Mr. Blanche makes it clear, as he writes, they did not uncover evidence that could predicate an investigation against uncharged third parties, and the review did not reveal credible evidence that Epstein blackmailed prominent individuals. Is no one getting in trouble here?
Well, the Department of Justice said in a letter that was released after Pam Bondi was in office, it was a very brief letter that was issued by the department when they first decided not to disclose any further Epstein files, that they did not find a basis for charging any additional individuals. So it sounds like Mr. Blanche's letter today is consistent with that prior brief letter memo by the Attorney General. So it appears the department is taking the position as of today that they don't have information to charge, sufficient information to criminally charge additional individuals. We will see if they change that position based on the ongoing review of the material. But of course, even if there are not criminal charges, there could be great sort of reputational consequence to people for being named in these materials.